Content warning. This episode contains discussion of violence, cannibalism, animal cruelty, and murder.
David Grann is one of my favorite authors. If you're not familiar with him and you like nonfiction books about crime and mysteries and danger, honestly, if you just like reading really good books, you need to be reading his work. A great place for you to start would be with nonfiction books like Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI, or The Lost City of Z, A Tale of Deadly Obsession in the Amazon, or The White Darkness, A Journey Across Antarctica, or any of his articles for The New Yorker, many of which deal with themes like death and detection.
He now has a new book out called The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder. It's the vividly told story of the ill-fated final voyage of the HMS Wager. Some background. From 1739 to 1748, Britain fought the War of Jenkins' Ear. Yes, that's really the name. Against the Spanish Empire. The Wager was part of a massive fleet sent out to capture Spanish vessels. But fate, foul weather, and fearsome scurvy intervened. The Wager became separated from the fleet, and on May 14, 1741, wrecked off the coast of what is now Chile.
For the surviving castaways, that was just the beginning of the story. Soon, the crew would find themselves caught between duty and individualism, order and chaos, morality and desperation. Some would resort to theft, physical assaults, animal cruelty, kidnapping, cannibalism, and even sudden, brutal murder. Then, the volatile situation gave way to the one crime the British Navy feared most of all, mutiny. In today's episode, we get to chat with David Grann about the powder keg that was The Wager, his writing and research process for this work, and his thoughts on crime and history and the nature of truth itself. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is Murder, Mutiny, and the Mists of Time, a conversation with David Grann. Hey there.
Hello, how are you?
Hey.
Good, how are you?
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Sure. I think it's got a lot of good books back there, it looks like.
Yeah. Some of them are by you.
You're definitely in there. We really admire your work a lot, and thank you so much for taking the time. Yeah.
Of course, happy to.
But yeah, I guess we can jump into it, right?
Let's dive right in.
Let's dive in. So can you tell us a bit about what The Wager is about, boil it down, and also how you went about getting this story?
Sure. The Wager is a kind of crazy saga of a shipwreck on a desolate island off the coast of Patagonia. It was an 18th century British naval ship. and it had suffered typhoons, and then it had suffered scurvy. And then as it was coming around the Chilean coastline, it smashed into rocks. And there the naval officers and crew tried to create a kind of imperial outpost of the British Empire. And instead, it gradually descended into chaos and Lord of the Flies. And there was murders and mutiny and cannibalism, you name it. The thing that really interested me about the story, though, was not just this crazy saga of what happened getting to the island and on the island, but after they returned, some of the castaways managed to get back to England. They managed to survive, completing some of the longest castaway voyages ever recorded. They are then, after everything they've been through, summoned to face a court-martial. And if they don't tell a convincing tale, they're going to get hanged after everything they've been through. And so they released these accounts, these early accounts. And it really was this kind of weird echo of our post-truth troubles today, where each person is kind of trying to save their lives, shading their story, manipulating their story. There are competing narratives, allegations of a kind of 18th century version of fake news. And then, of course, the British Empire is watching all this saying, you know, I don't know if we like any of these stories. They all make us look really bad. They make us look like brutes, not like gentlemen. And so will they begin to manufacture their own kind of mythic tale of history? So I don't know if that boiled it down, but that's a summary.
Absolutely. And it's a gripping read, but it is a stressful read, I will say.
Yes, they go. Yes, it will make your own life feel a lot better. Yes.
We don't have scurvy, at least at this point. I'm curious, in terms of your previous work, Killers of the Flower Moon, I understand that you went to a museum, saw a photograph that was basically torn, and were inspired to start working on that after a museum employee told you that the devil was in that picture, and you kind of were trying to figure out what's the story behind that. Was there a similar moment for The Wager where you kind of were like, okay, I'm in, I'm writing about this?
So I'm always struck by, when I look back on my stories, how many of them begin with a letter, a photograph, some piece of correspondence I find in an archive, in a museum, in somebody's house. And it's kind of holds some clue to some important piece of history or saga that I didn't know about. And in this case, one of my pet obsessions was mutinies. That's kind of one of these things I've always just been fascinated with. What is it about these organizations that are designed by the state to enforce order? What causes these enforcers to suddenly disorder? Are they these extreme outlaws, or is there something kind of rotten at the core of the system that justifies the rebellion? And this is kind of, you see it play out in literature and film, this kind of contradictory or portrayal of how do we look at mutineers. So in any case, I was interested in mutinies. I was doing a little bit of research, and I came upon an 18th century journal written by John Byron, who was a 16-year-old midshipman on the Wager. And, it was this old journal. It was written in this old English, the F's were S's or the S's were F's, however you say that. And the prose was kind of stilted. And yet I kept pausing over these arresting words, like him restraining a boy who was trying to eat a liver, because he was so starved with cannibalism, the description of losing their ship and it breaking apart. And I began to realize that this very archaic text really held the clues to one of the greatest kind of sagas of survival and adventure I had come across, and also crime in many ways. And on top of that, I then learned that John Byron was the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron. And I went and looked up some of Lord Byron's poems, and in it he has descriptions which he has taken or been influenced by from his grandfather's narrative, or what he referred to as my granddad's narrative. And so that was the first kind of hook that got into me and really got hold of me. And then I went and started to dig up these other narratives written by and journals that were kept by these various members of the expedition. And I was pretty much, from that point on, held and wrapped, and that began about a 6-year process of research and writing.
You spoke earlier about the different versions of this. And, even today, with contemporary events, when you watch things on Fox News and MSNBC, it can be hard to sort out what the actual truth is of what really happened. So how do you go about doing that when the events are so far in the past?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And so one of the ways you do it is you are transparent with the reader and you almost enlist the reader in the process of detection. We all become our own decoders. So in this case, I really decided to structure the book from the point of view of three members of the expedition: the captain of the wager, David Cheap; John Bulkley, who was the gunner, who, though he's probably the most capable seaman on board the wager, because he did not come from the aristocracy, he could not ever become a captain of a ship; and John Byron, the midshipman, who we just talked about. And you can see how each one of them tells the story from their own point of view. And it gives you insight into how we all shape our stories, how we all kind of elide certain facts. What's interesting about them is they don't disagree on the fundamental events. They all agree this person shot somebody, we were starving, the ship wrecked. But what they choose to emphasize and what they choose to leave out gives you great insight. And so by alternating these perspectives, you start to see both how they're all shading, and you also are getting a fuller portrait. And that was kind of how I did it, and hopefully the reader will do it. And just to give you a really good example of this, so like there's a scene where the captain says, in his account, wow, I was forced to proceed to extremities. And then John Byron in his account will essentially say, he shot him right in the head. And you just see the way they depict what happened and how they shape it and manipulate it is just so telling. And so part of the thing I wanted the book to do is to hopefully show how, not that the truth doesn't exist, the truth really does exist. And I'm a zealous believer in trying to pursue it. But getting at it, which was your question, is very hard. And we often all, even when we're not doing criminal deeds, we all kind of shape our stories. We like to look better. We like to live with what we've done or what we haven't done. Joan Didion said we all tell ourselves stories in order to live. And we do. We all kind of do, and we shape them. And so this is a really interesting way to illuminate that process of consciousness that we all do, and hopefully will make us more effective decoders. But we often think like, what was crazy about this story is I would go to the archives and be reading in the 18th century, these old accounts. And then I would come home and I'd flip on the news and you'd hear alternative facts and fake news. And I was like, oh my God, this 18th century story is a weird parable for our own times. It's one of the reasons I love history, because you can come across these stories. You don't yet know what all their themes are and what they mean. And then you start to see how they resonate. And you see the connections even with the present. We're all standing on history, whether we recognize it or not.
You're capturing these voices and these personalities of people who are centuries dead and come from a very different time than our own. I mean, there's certain commonalities with the human experience, but a lot of the problems they're dealing with here are not something we have to deal with today. And I'm just curious, did you find yourself gravitating towards some figures more than others, or maybe like siding with them, or did you really try to keep
it's interesting. Well, when you're writing, I'm using this approach where I was trying to understand and depict the perspective as each person was giving it. You spend a lot of time trying to understand that person. You don't necessarily sympathize, but you're trying to understand them. And what's interesting about these figures is, unlike Killers of the Flower Moon, where there was kind of good and evil. I could never understand. I mean, I could explain it and document it, but I mean, it was the people's actions were just so morally repugnant. And in The Wager, you have flawed human beings who do bad things. Some of them do murder, some succumb to cannibalism, some cheat, some steal, some rob. You see them doing these things, but they're not necessarily fundamentally evil. So you can kind of understand in their circumstances what they're doing, and you're trying to show that. But the person I think you at least for me, who I could most relate to, or who I think provides eyes and ears for most of the readers onto these events, is John Byron, because he was just a child at the time, or a teenager, 16 when he leaves. By the time he makes it back to England, he's 22. His family doesn't even recognize him. he set off with these ideas of kind of living the romance of the sea, and instead he's treated to the horror of the elements, but then also even the deeper horrors committed by his fellow countrymen, his fellow shipmates. He's an innocent in a way, being introduced to the kind of cruelty of humanity. And so I think in a way he's the one you can somewhat identify with. I mean, there's a part in his narrative where he describes, when there's all the feuding going on the island, where the castaways are stuck and trapped on this island, and they're about to go to war against each other. And he kind of takes and he builds a little hut away from the rest of the community. There's basically two factions, and he doesn't want to be part of either of them. He just kind of moves to the side. And that you're reading that, you're like, okay, I get that. I would kind of want to just get out of the way.
Yeah. I mean, I won't get into any spoilers, but he has to make decisions through this where you can see him kind of going from being a kid, being like, what do I do, to like forming his own ethos in a way. And it's really fascinating.
He's coming of age. He is coming of age. I mean, we all come of age. He's coming of age in the most arduous, challenging circumstances. And you see someone who's very passive in a way, because he's part of an organization in which your main mission is to follow orders, to a point where he has to kind of formulate his own decisions and assert his own agency.
And you mentioned this, there's so many acts of violence, attempted murder, violent robberies, kidnapping, and just various bad actions throughout the book. But it's not really a traditional crime book, but it does deal with those crimes. And you mentioned like the environment influencing that, and like it's not necessarily a conspiracy of pure evil like in Killers of the Flower Moon, but you do have this kind of breakdown in order, breakdown in hierarchy. And how do you think about the violence and crimes that occur in The Wager? I mean, can we look at this as a traditional like Lord of the Flies scenario? We're out of civilization, so we're having a hard time coping, or something larger at play here in your view?
Well, all crimes to some degrees are reflections of human nature, and they're all a variety of motives that can do that. And there are sometimes circumstances that can generate crime. Sometimes it's, someone's just psychopathic. I've written about psychopathic people, but I really look at The Wager as a really interesting. One of the things that drew me to the story was that when they're on the ship, that is in many ways a floating civilization where you have all these strangers thrown together from all these ages, as young as 6 to the cook on The Wager is in his 80s. They're all thrown together. There's aristocrats, there's dandies, there's city paupers. You have a free black seaman, and they're all kind of trying to be molded into this civilization. And then that fortress, that floating civilization collapses, and they're on this island, and they're trapped in this place with very little food, constant cold, unrelenting winds. And to me, it's situations like that often provide a laboratory that kind of test and reveal people. And inevitably, while they are trapped on that island, it will reveal their own secret nature of each person. And sometimes you see extraordinary acts of heroism, of daring, of resilience, of survival. And at other times you see acts of perfidy, of wantonness, of selfishness, of cruelty. And so I think you get the spectrum in that laboratory, and you get to see and better understand human nature, which is why we all are interested in crimes. We wouldn't be interested with them if we didn't think they revealed something larger about ourselves or the societies in which we live. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but to me, it's this weird window in. It's this kind of perfect laboratory that will test human nature under extreme circumstances and inevitably reveal something about that nature. And so that's where we see the good, and that's where we see the bad.
I think one theme when we were talking about it, we kept coming back to is not to be flippant, but is the real crime here sort of imperialism to a certain extent, right?
100%. Yes. Are they part of a system? Yes. It's a great point. I mean, yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because, a lot of these people are kind of thrown onto this ship. Some of them are pressed. For listeners aren't aware, like, there were these press gangs that kind of went out to pubs, and they were short men. So they would just kind of round you up if you were a mariner, if you had like a little hat that said you were a sailor, or you had some tar on your fingertips because tar was used on a ship. They said, okay, well, that was a seaman. Let's just take them. And they just basically jail you and throw you onto a ship and send you on a 3-year voyage, dangerous voyage. So a lot of these people are kind of sent unwillingly. Part of the other thing that really drew me to this story was the British Empire. Its claim that justified it was that its civilization was somehow superior. Therefore, it justified going into these other realms of the world and conquering these other people and taking their valuable natural resources. And so here you get on the island, suddenly you see that revealed the essential lie of that. You see that, here their human nature is revealed of many of these people who are supposed to be the vanguard of the empire. And many of them are both perpetrators, but they're also sometimes victims because they have been pressed and shoved onto the system. One of the things, too, that was struck me when I read their accounts was how little they are conscious of the imperialist system that they are part of. They're so concerned with their own staying alive, making their money, supporting their family, their dreams of glory, that they're not often conscious. And yet it's that kind of, that almost that unwittingness that allows empires to preserve themselves, that you're kind of part of a system, serving a system, even when you're off sometimes being victimized by that system. You're not questioning it. And so I think the architecture, the frame in which this expedition took place is really important. It's one of the things that really drew me to the story because it can reveal these larger forces. And we talked a lot about the stories these individuals told, and some of these stories became the bestsellers of their day and were sensations. And yet part of the point I also try to talk about is that there are some stories that are left out of the narratives and that can't be told. And some of those are the people who the system itself have essentially erased.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting reading the book along similar lines. There were a few moments when they encountered native people who helped them basically be able to save them. And they treat those people so badly that it doesn't work out.
Yeah, there is a moment when they are on the island where a group of indigenous Patagonians, and they were known as the Karaskar. There were a few thousand of them, but they would travel in small familial groups, and they had a huge territory which they would move up and down the Chilean coast, hundreds and hundreds of miles. They lived almost exclusively off marine resources, and they traveled and spent much of their time in canoes. They were sometimes referred to as the nomads of the sea. And so when the castaways are trapped on this island, suffering, beginning to starve, a group of them shows up in their canoes and essentially offers them a lifeline, because unlike the castaways who are struggling to find any food, the Karaskar had adapted to these very harsh circumstances, this harsh environment. They would stay warm by always keeping a fire going even in their canoes. And they knew where to find food along the coastline. They could find fish, and they could find sea urchins and mussels, and they would go out. And so they begin to bring some food back. But then some of the British castaways are getting wilder and crazier. And at a certain point, the Karaskar, look at the growing violence and chaos among the castaways, and they're like, we're out of here. We're not gonna, this is threatening. And so they're being mistreated, and they leave. And because of that, many more castaways died. They basically cut off their own lifeline. And it gets at these attitudes, and it gets at these perceptions and how these perceptions can be destructive.
And I found the book really enthralling, and the people seemed very real, and it was a very rich work. And so after I spent a couple of days reading it, it was, a little disappointing to see it end and to close the book. And you actually spent, you said, about 6 years researching this.
Yeah.
So what's it like for you after spending that much time with these people in this world to move on?
Yeah, it's hard. It's always a strange experience. You inhabit a world for so long. I even went to Wager Island. I made my own trip there. And if you look over here, all these are books and documents. If you could see my office, for the listeners can't see it, but my office is still piled with So I still have the kind of the remnants, the debris of the research scattered about me. So it is always kind of challenging to move on and to kind of figure out what's next. And I think what hopefully eventually happens is you find your next project and then that gets under your skin. But I haven't found what that next project is yet. And so I'm still a little bit caught, kind of living a little bit with these people I spent so much time with and trying to figure out what is next. But it is always a hard, strange process when you've spent so long researching and working on one project. There's such a mono obsession involved in these projects. Killers of the Flower Moon took me 5 years, and this took me, more than 5 years.
Do those characters and voices that you sort of immersed in for years then continue to sort of like haunt you in a way afterwards?
Well, sometimes you think about them. Sometimes you want to get it's always interesting when you spend a lot of time with people. There's some you're like, for Killers of the Flower Moon, for people who've read that book, I want to get William Hale and these killers out of my head and as far away from me as possible. And there's almost a relief, to be honest, to get those people gone. But then there are other people who stay with you, and you still periodically think about Killers of the Flower Moon. It was Molly Burkhart and her family who were being targeted by this conspiracy because they had oil money. And then there are, in The Wager, there are moments with Byron. I'll still pick up Lord Byron's poetry and read a little bit. There's a certain relief though also because to some extent you're like, oh my God, scurvy and typhoons and starvation and cannibalism, and so there's also a certain relief, but I'm still at that point too where I can excitedly talk about it.
Absolutely.
What was it like to take the trip and see the place?
So I spent about 2 years doing research in archives, which is probably where I'm most suited for. But after about 2 years, it was just kind of gnawing at me, sort of things I didn't know. And I was like, could I fully understand what these people had gone through unless I went? So I got into my head this cockamamie idea that I would try to get to the island. And I found a Chilean captain who had a little boat who would take me in photographs. The boat images he had sent me looked really big. And then when I got there, I was really shocked to see how small the boat was. It was wood heated. We would fill the water from glacier water from along the islands. And we got there and, for the first 3 days, we couldn't depart because it was so rough that the Coast Guard had closed the port. But then eventually we set out. Early on, we kind of followed the sheltered channels of Patagonia. So you're fairly protected. It's really very beautiful. Kind of think of it as a kind of very chilling beauty to it. Very desolate. For days and days, we didn't see another boat or person. And then at a certain point, the captain says, well, now if we're going to get to Wager Island, which is located, it's now known as Wager Island, which is located in the Gulf de Penas, which translates as the Gulf of Sorrows, or some people refer to it as the Gulf of Pain. Either applies, Gulf of Sorrow or Gulf of Pain. You could pick. And he says, well, if we're going to get there now, we have to head out into the Pacific. And so we headed out into the open ocean. And that's when I first got my first real glimpse of these seas and what they were like. And it was rough. I had to sit down the whole time on the floor because if I stood, I would have been chucked and broken a limb. You couldn't eat, because you couldn't do anything. You just had to sit there and hold on, do that for about 8 or 9 hours a day. And I was dosed on like Dramamine, and I needed somebody to pass the time. So I listened to an audiobook of Moby Dick, which in retrospect was probably not the most soothing thing to have done. But eventually we had a very skilled captain. Eventually we get into the Gulf of Pain and we cut across it and we get to the island. And we then take a Zodiac onto the island and we explored it and we explored the encampment. And it was really important for me because it really gave me a sense of, one, just how, I was bundled up. I had multiple layers and wool hat and gloves and boots. And I was still really cold. It was winter. It was about 30 degrees. And it's just this cold. It's a very damp cold because it's always raining or sleeting almost every day. So I could only imagine what it was like for those castaways who had only bits of clothing, much of which disintegrated over time when they were stuck on that island for months. And also, they would always describe how they couldn't find food. And until I went there. I was like, well, that seems so strange. Like you can't find any food on an island. I was like, it's got to be something. And sure enough, there are no animals. I mean, the only animals are birds that kind of fly about, but there are no living other creatures. There are along some of the shorelines, some of the coastlines, you can find some mussels. The castaways has soon exhausted their supply of mussels along the shore. It's very mountainous. It's very difficult to walk across. And spending time there gave me some sense of why one British officer described it as a place in which the soul of man dies in them. So, but it was a very essential. And what's interesting is I never write about that in the book. I don't write about my own trip, but it was so essential in kind of breathing life and helping me to understand what it was like for those castaways. At one point, one of the people in my group said, we were looking by near where the castaways encampment had been. There was a little stream, and he pointed at it, and there were some fragments of wood that were bound together, and they're 18th century wood. They're kind of bound together with these tree nails, which is kind of like wooden pegs. And they are believed to be the remnants of His Majesty's ship, the Wager. And they have been discovered by a British and Chilean expedition in 2006. And so that's how we knew what they were. And that's all that remains of that furious struggle that once took place there.
That is incredible.
What was it like to see that?
Oh, it's breathtaking. I mean, what was breathtaking about it is one, that it's there, but then also this kind of haunting quality, this haunting notion that I had spent all these years kind of documenting the sound and the fury, these kind of ravaging dreams of empire and all the disasters that it led to. And yet here, the only kind of remnant of that are these fragments of the ship. And after kind of listening and documenting all that sound and fury, the only sound I could hear, and I just stood there listening to it for a long time, was the eternal hush of the sea. I just kept listening to the hush of the sea. And that is what survives.
That's your Ozymandias moment. You often kind of put yourself into the story just to more experience it so you can better write about it. But as far as the research side of things goes, I'd be very curious to learn more about your process with that from reading the book. It sounds very extensive, but was there any particularly memorable eureka moment that you got when you were looking through all of these files and archives and whatnot?
Well, the first thing that is just kind of remarkable is how there's these trove of documents that have survived, 300 years now to 1740? I can't count. Nearly 300 years. Somebody count for me. All these centuries. Some of these documents have survived typhoons. Some of them went around the world. Some of them involved sea battles and cannons hitting the ship. And some of them have survived even shipwreck. And so the fact they exist at all, and you can go to these archives in England and you can pull out these documents from the 1700s that were on these ships, and they're so brittle, like when you open them, just dust lifts off them, and you have to handle them so gently, and you can kind of see the paper stock, and you can see the quills in which, the ink fading in which they wrote in them. So that in itself is kind of breathtaking. And then a lot of these documents are kind of wondrous because some of them are logbooks where they're describing each day's events on the ship. And so you get almost a day-to-day diary log of what is happening. And you can really document through the storms. You see the beginnings of the scurvy and them describing the passing of bodies and the death of certain, departed this life today. And at a certain point, you start seeing that day after each entry, you just see more and more deaths. Even the muster books, which were the kind of rolls of people who were on a ship. It's like they would be mustered and they would be counted when they arrived on the ship, who was there and what their position was. When I first looked at these muster books, so they look like gibberish to me because there's just a lot of abbreviations and symbols. And I had to kind of gradually figure out and speak to naval historians to better learn how to interpret them and kind of learn this kind of coded language. And, one of the things that really takes your breath away is there's a symbol they use, an abbreviation they use called DD. So when DD, I was like, what does DD mean? DD mean? And then I found out that DD means discharged dead. So it means they died on the expedition. So you're going down a muster book and you're looking at a page, one page of the muster, I don't know, 20, 30 names, I don't know, 20 names probably. And then you see on some pages, you would see DD, 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 maybe one knot, DD, DD, DD. And you start to get a sense of the toll. That's nearly 2,000 people originally embarked on this expedition. Only a couple hundred completed it, and more than 1,300 died. More than 1,300 died. So sometimes it can be even a quiet moment where you're, just not even a long passage, just these initials that can be a kind of revelation unto themselves. History speaks, and it speaks in these kind of unexpected ways.
I was wondering, you've been interested in mutiny, you mentioned, and of course that's at the heart of this book and the story of the wager. And I'm curious, I mean, it's also something, it's like this almost spontaneous combustion of like order and hierarchy and like the mission essentially, and people deciding, okay, I'm going to do things my way, I guess. In your view, having studied the wager so intensely, what do you make of this particular mutiny? Is it much like other mutinies? Is there something different here? Did Captain Cheap somehow invite this? Is it just horrible luck? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it gets to kind of one of the central kind of tenacious philosophical debates. And what's interesting is, you asked me this question, but the men themselves at the time are almost having this philosophical debate about so obviously one difference is they are on an island. So the ship is wrecked. They're no longer on the ship. Should the captain remain in power because that's his title? Or could somebody like John Bulkeley, who could never be a captain of a ship in that time period because he didn't come from the aristocracy, he was an instinctive leader, could he suddenly emerge? Cheap obviously believes he should remain the commanding force and the officer, and he also believes they should still govern and live by the same rules that had governed them on the ship. But more and more of the people are gravitating to Bulkeley, who kind of invokes these very populist phrases that will resonate with us today. Even though this was before the American Revolution, he's using words like life and liberty. And he's kind of stirring the people. And then they're also having questions. So not only who should be a leader and what is the nature of leadership, but then also they're having moral debates about duty and honor. Are they obliged, as Cheap is? Cheap wants to somehow build a castaway boat and then meet up with the rest of the expedition and continue on their way to serve the empire. And Bulkeley and a lot of the other men and boys are like, are you kidding me? We've had enough of this already. We're out of here. We want to go the other way. Enough with duty and honor. And so what's so interesting is they are, even while they are starving, they are holding these debates. And I will say, like, you asked me the question, and I almost don't want to answer it because I feel like it's such a central, as I say in the preface, like I kind of leave it to the readers for history's judgment. And like, you could see these debates playing out. You could see the thorny issues that, and I think people will probably reach different conclusions. But what's to me was so interesting that even in starving, they're having these deep philosophical debates on what is the nature of duty, loyalty, and that forbidden word, mutiny. Should they mutiny?
It's so fascinating. And I gotta say, like, I found myself strangely gravitating towards Captain Cheap. And then I'm like, is that because I'm the oldest sibling in a family? And I'm like, my authority should not be questioned.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Like, I mean, Cheap is in some ways, like, he's in some ways the most problematic figure, and yet in some ways you could really sympathize with him. He's like, he was this guy, he had all these debts in England, and he kind of always found refuge on a ship, and he thought this mission was going to be his chance to finally attain what he always wanted, which was to become a captain of a ship, which he achieves, and to maybe capture a lucrative treasure prize, capture a Spanish ship. And then of course he ends up on this island in these extreme circumstances, and if had life dealt him a different hand, it's possible he might have lived, he might have succeeded. I mean, he might have attained some of these, but wrecked on this ship, his character is put to the test. So I think you can, I had a perverse sympathy for Cheap. I really did.
And then Bulkley's fascinating, where he's kind of, as you said, like as Americans, we're kind of like, oh wait, yeah,
and he's kind of like the Uberman. He's like, just like, he's so like, he's like, I will survive, and like, and he's cunning and ruthless, but kind of ingenious and And also, like, remarkably for we don't know exactly what class he was from, but probably lower to middle class. He's clearly literate, so I don't think he was the lowest class, but he clearly he's a remarkable writer and thinker and survivalist, and he leads this castaway voyage, which is just it's one of the longest castaway voyages ever recorded. And he's got like all these men and people packed into a ship where they can't even move. They can't even stand. They're so tightly packed. And he's navigating this little boat through some of these treacherous seas. And he manages to complete 3,000 miles of a journey. So he's really this kind of remarkable figure, but he's tough and he's, yeah. So he's a hard nut.
and we can't forget the third group, which is the people who just want to do crimes.
Yeah. Then there's just the marauders. The marauders are the seceders. They were called the seceders, which I found so funny. They just leave the camp entirely and they just wander the island wildly, marauding and stealing and pillaging. And one of them appears to have committed 2 murders.
I remember a quote from an interview you gave a while ago, in which you said you were very influenced by the Sherlock Holmes stories. You identified to a certain extent with Dr. Watson. And one thing that comes into my mind is that some of those stories have like a meta quality to them, where Holmes sometimes complains to Dr. Watson about how Dr. Watson portrays him. And so I'm curious, do you ever wonder or speculate about how some of the people you write about would feel about your books?
Oh my goodness. I have never thought about that. You do that's not entirely true. I mean, you do when I write things where people are alive or descendants are alive, you're very conscious, okay, how are they going to be received? But when you write about people from the 18th century, there is a freeing quality in that. I always say as a reporter, and I say this when I do stories about people who are alive, and a lot of people I care about or I get to know, and you develop relationships with people inevitably when you spend a lot of time reporting and interviewing them, but you're ultimately beholden to the truth. And that is what your ultimate interest is. And so in some ways, when you're writing about something in the 18th century and you don't have to worry so much about what they're going to think, it allows you in some ways to be not unvarnished, but just frank. You don't have to, you can really show things and depict them as they are and as best you see them. So in some ways it's harder because in some ways you're desperate to interview these people and you're desperate in some ways to get some of their points of view. In this case, what is nice is you have so much of their documentation that was contemporaneous. So you can really get close to that. But you're kind of somewhat free to just tell the story as best you can and get at the truth. And I don't, I hope, I guess to answer your question though, I always hope that when anyone reads what I write, they would find me judicious and that I'm giving everybody their say. I give everybody their say in the story and everybody is getting a chance to give their perspective and their point of view. And so my hope is that if they could come back to alive, they would say, okay, yeah, you were judicious, you were fair. I might not agree with everything, but you were fair. You gave me my say. And that was a really interesting question at the time, right? Because some of the people get left behind on the island and they wonder, will anyone ever be able to tell their story or their side of their story ever be told? So one of the things you can try to do with an account like this is try to tell each side.
In terms of, this particular story, it really does get at the nature of like, what is the truth? What is history? And it's kind of like this debate and conversation between these disparate sides that you're sort of knitting together. And I'm curious, has working on this changed at all how you view history or how you view the truth or like any of those kind of big heady questions?
There were kind of 2 levels to that. So one is, as I've reported over the years, and you'd ask me the kind of meta question, but you become more conscious of the nature of storytelling, of shaping stories and how that works. And you realize more the way people you write about shape their stories and tell you. And then, of course, you're shaping their stories. I've become very conscious of that process. And what's so rich about the Wager story is you can show that. You can really reveal these people are shaping their stories. And to some degree, I'm shaping their stories. And you can be transparent about that. The reader can see some of that. On the question of history, though, I'd say after Killers of the Flower, sometimes projects lead to other projects. And so after Killers of the Flower Moon, I was really interested in why here was one of the worst and most sinister crimes, and really one of the worst racial injustices in American history, and yet it had been largely excised from our conscious. Outside of the Osage Nation, few of us, including myself, had not been taught this. We didn't know anything about it. It was not part of our collective history. So I was very interested after working on that. I'm very haunted by why certain chapters of history are told and certain chapters aren't. And one of the things that drew me to this story was you could really see the processes of how that happens. You could see how when the castaways get back to England and their lives are at stake at a court-martial, they are fighting to tell their story and they want their story to prevail. But ultimately, you get to see how the British Empire wants a different story to prevail and how it begins to burnish that story. And we begin to see why certain stories are told in history and passed down and why other stories are left out and cut out of the story. So that was really one of the things that drew me to this particular history, is because it really is an interesting case study where you can actually document that happening. I mean, there are still gaps. You wish you knew more and some of the decision making, but you really get to see how this unfolds, how history is made, and how in some ways it can be manipulated and in some ways it can be elided. As I say in the book, just as people shape their stories, so do empires and so do nations.
I'm curious, at this point in your career, are people pitching you stories constantly? And then the other side of that is, how do you decide ultimately at this point what to pursue or consider as a project, whether it's a longer form article or a book?
It's always the hardest part. I mean, occasionally people send me, I welcome any pitches. If anyone have out there, please feel free to email me. It's the hardest part is coming up with good stories. And I think the challenge is to find a story that is hopefully interesting or hold you in the grip or is compelling in some ways, but also illuminate something larger. So I do tell a lot of crime stories. This is kind of an unusual crime story. I don't know how quite, because it can be classified in multiple genres, The Wager, but I do a lot of stories that involve crime, like The Wager or Killers of the Flower Moon, or a lot of my stories for the New Yorker magazine. For me, though, in telling those stories, I'll read any crime stories, but the ones I want to tell are ones that hopefully illuminate something larger about our society, about our institutions, about our systems, about human nature. And so that's what makes it so hard to find the right stories, because there are some fascinating stories that you may read in a tabloid that's kind of gothic and compelling, but I don't want to tell that story. And so where can I find those stories that are both hopefully hold you in the grip, but yet also hopefully take you someplace? For me, the themes of The Wager were so resonant. It's this crazy adventure survival story. Like you're like, okay, it can't get worse. And then it gets worse. Like, oh, we got scurvy. Okay. Oh, we're in a typhoon. Okay, it can't get worse than that. Oh, we're shipwrecked. It can't get worse than that. Oh, we're on an island with no food. It can't get worse than that. Oh my God, some of the people are going mad and marauding and stealing. Oh my God, we got a murder on the island. Like, so, it just like, it can't get, oh my God, we make it back to England. We survived it. Oh no, we're going to get hanged. Like, it's the craziest story ever. So, but amid all that, you get these deeper themes about human nature, about society, about imperialism, about racism, about storytelling, and about the battles over history and the battles over truth. And that hopefully, at least that's my hope, but that's what drew me to the story. So it's a real challenge. And there isn't really any easy way to do it. It's like I read a lot, I talk to people, I'm always searching, I'm looking right now, I'm trying to find it, but for me, it's always the most restless, terrifying point because I'm such an obsessive by nature. And until I have something to hunt, I'm just like, I don't know what to do with myself. So again, if anyone has a good idea, please send it.
Sounds like you're in a typhoon of ideas right now.
Exactly. But it's very hard to find. When I was a newspaper reporter, I just did shorter magazine pieces. Like, it's not as hard because, you're just moving on. You're doing a lot of things that, if you're going to spend, 3 to 5 years of your life on a project, you better.
Got to pick the right one. And
you don't want to take a wrong turn. You don't want to end up on Wager Island.
Have you ever taken a wrong turn and started a project or gotten interested in something and then said to yourself, well, there's not a book here, there's not an article here, and then had to abandon it?
Yes, I have. I try, though, I've learned over time to you want to be fairly ruthless early on because you don't want to get to that 2-year point. That's the thing you want to avoid. What you don't want to do is I just spent a year on this and it's going nowhere. So before I commit to something, I do a lot of preliminary research, even in the first month or two, to kind of make a more informed decision. Because if you don't do that, then if you start to sense if the ship is going down, don't try to patch it up endlessly. Let the ship go down and just hop off while you can still get to shore. Because then the biggest, sorry, I'm killing ship metaphors here. The thing you don't want to do is you don't want to be 2 years or 3 years into a project and be like, oh my God, I took a wrong turn.
Absolutely. I'm curious, you mentioned you've done so much work touching upon crime, and it's not just Killers of the Flower Moon or The Wager, but also things like Serious Circumstances, Trial by Fire, and some of your articles. Yes. And having done so much of that work, are there certain sort of truths or at least, topics or ideas around crime that you've sort of formed as a result of doing that work over time?
Each story often illuminates something to me. I almost, no matter what I research, I'm such a generalist. I learn, part of the reasons I tell these stories is not because I know them, it's because I don't know them. And so I do them to learn. For me, it's just it's perpetual discovery. So when I worked on Trial by Fire about Cameron Todd Willingham, a man who was executed for allegedly setting a fire that killed his children in Texas, and then it was revealed that the purported scientific evidence to justify his execution as conviction turned out to be complete bunk and was compared by scientists to witchcraft later on. And that you realize that this more than likely innocent man was executed, and it was certainly a wrongful execution. That revealed to me so many stages of flaws that can occur in our system, and the fragility and the need for reforms. There were so many systemic failures along the way before he ultimately was put to death. And so that kind of taught me something about systems. It taught me also something, and I would say this is true of a lot of the stories, about perceptions, because in crimes you often have perceptions of witnesses that may change over time, or how biases can affect them, perceptions of investigators and misperceptions by investigators. You see people locking in and getting tunnel vision. After Trial by Fire, I'm always just so conscious of, in my own stories, to try to avoid tunnel vision, to be open to the evidence. I may think a story's going somewhere, but then new evidence comes in. I'm like, oh, no, this story's about something else, or it's going somewhere else. I have to be able to follow it. Mysterious Circumstances was a story about the world's greatest Sherlock Holmes scholar who was found mysteriously garroted in his apartment. And toward the end of that story, his sister said to me, I kind of investigate what happened to him. Was he murdered? Was it a suicide? And I think the circumstantial evidence made a pretty compelling case about what had happened, but there's no 100% proof. It's a circumstantial case. And I remember his sister saying to me, we have to learn to live with doubts. And I think that's something that has stayed with me. You have to learn to live with doubts. And a lot of my stories have doubts and gaps because there's either gaps in evidence, there's gaps in records, there's pieces missing, and you want to be transparent and show those doubts. So I don't think there's one lesson that comes across. There's kind of multiple lessons, but I would say there is a central theme for me about perceptions and misperceptions in many of those cases, about how people themselves are making perceptions, and then also how investigators are making perceptions or misperceptions. And it got back to, you had asked me why I identify more with Dr. Watson than Sherlock Holmes, because what all these stories have taught me, I guess, both the crime stories and others, is just how fallible we are and how difficult it is to document the truth, that we really need to be pretty humble about that and recognize our own inadequacies. If we do that, we're less likely to make errors. And so, when I was young, I thought I would, be like Sherlock Holmes, because I would be able to solve all the world's problems and be like that master detective. And then over time, you're like, oh gosh, I'm just like Watson stumbling through the dark, trying to make sense of things. And we're all Dr. Watson. Some of us are a little better at it, but we're all Watson. Sherlock Holmes is a fairy tale character.
You talk about being influenced by the Holmes stories. I'm curious, what other writers or historians have influenced or inspired you over the years?
Yeah. So it's funny. I read so much history or nonfiction or documents or journals for my work, but the books I really read the most for pleasure, and I think that in some ways influence me, are more novels, not in any kind of literal way, but just they kind of just inspire me, or they often show me something just about human nature or character. And I'll tend to pick out books based on what I'm working on. So for The Wager, I went back and read almost everything by Melville. I read Moby Dick, which just blew my mind. I must have read that in college or high school, but I didn't remember. And I think back then I just wasn't old enough to get it, at what a just fantastically and strange and kind of sui generis book that is. And I read some Conrad, like Lord Jim, and a lot of these old kind of sea narratives. When I was working on Killers of the Flower Moon, I read a lot of kind of stories that were kind of set in the West and kind of Western landscapes, just to kind of put me in the spirit almost of the place and the area. I read a lot of Cormac McCarthy. And sometimes these books can have unexpected influences and effects. When I was working on Killers of the Flower Moon, I was really stuck about how to structure that book, because there were so many people, so many murder victims, so many killers, so many people involved. Not one figure also could carry the whole story, because they weren't witness or participants in all of it, because it's spread over so much time. And I was reading Absalom by Faulkner one night, and it was like 11 at night. I was like, oh my gosh. It's a very hard novel to understand. I don't know if I still fully understand Absalom, but in any case, it is this kind of hypnotic book. But I'm reading and I realize he's telling the story from the point of view of three different people. And it's kind of the elliptical nature of history. And I was like, that's it. I'll tell it from the point of view of three different people. And the light bulb went off, and it just really cracked and solved the whole problem for me that I had been stuck for months not knowing how to structure. So I always try to read. Sometimes it's not so linear, the influence, but sometimes like that, it really is like a breakthrough, like completely unexpected. I'm just reading a novel, and the next thing I know, it's like, that's the way I could structure this book. So I try my best to kind of read widely to kind of find influence or just inspiration. To me, I'm always just struck by beautiful writing, or writing that's interesting or compelling. So people who are just great wordsmiths, whether it be Willa Cather or just people who could just use words to create visual images and also build observations or descriptions into emotional power. Because I think that's also something, the more I read, I used to be so focused on facts, and I still am, facts. But if you're telling a story about people who lived through history or through anything, these are emotional experiences too. They're not just like these desiccated facts. So how through the facts can you convey some of that emotional power? What is it like to be on a ship that is your home and that's your fortress, and suddenly it's sinking and you're suddenly cast down on an island? It's not just he was cast down on an island. There is an emotional power, and you try to find that through the records and to try to convey that while being very factual in conveying them.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think The Wager succeeds in that, because I think, you can still look at them as imperialists and furthering the mission of this British Empire, which is, awful, essentially. But you do feel for them when that ship's going down.
Yes. Yes.
We're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask you, is there anything we didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention about The Wager, your previous works, your thoughts on writing in general, writing nonfiction?
I don't know. I think you guys covered it. I think, you have anything else?
I have one thing. Would you ever consider writing something not nonfiction, more on the lines of a novel or say a memoir, anything like that?
That's interesting. Early in my life when I was young, I wrote some fiction and poetry, and then I really kind of settled into nonfiction. And right now that is just so much a focus. I have been thinking a little bit about maybe something for the New Yorker, which would be a story about someone, but would involve a little bit more memoir, telling a little bit more about myself. But that's always, I'm a very, it's funny because I think I think it was Janet Malcolm who said this, something about biographers. I don't remember the line, but basically biographers just come and they just pillage and take your secrets. And I'm always, as someone who probably pillages secrets, I'm always so wary about sharing stuff about my own life. But I have thought a little bit about that as it might relate to a certain story. But I would say my primary focus and love and obsessions is, and I think also what I'm most talented and suited for. Like, you kind of figure out what you're better at. And for me, there are people who can imagine things. And then I think of myself much more as an excavator. If I can find the right story, I'm just excavating. I'm just digging to find the truth and then hopefully constructing in such a way that is compelling. But I'm really excavating. I don't have an imagination. I love reading novels, but my imagination. And what I also love about the nonfiction too is there are so many of the stories and things that happen in these stories were things I write about where I'm just your mouth kind of dry. It's just stranger than fiction. There's that great truth is stranger than fiction. There's that great line in Sherlock Holmes where I don't remember it exactly, but something where Sherlock Holmes is saying to Watson, if you could just peer into all these houses and lift up the roofs and eavesdrop, basically, you would hear all these ultra crazy, unfathomable stories that they would be stranger than anything than the mind of humans could invent. And I often feel that way with nonfiction.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been really delightful and a real treat for us, and we really appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. Good luck with everything. I can't wait to listen.
Thanks to David for talking to us. It was a pleasure speaking with him. Personally, his work has profoundly impacted my understanding of what nonfiction writing can be.
If you're interested in picking up a copy of The Wager, which we highly recommend you do, we'll include a link for your convenience. But just know it's going to be available online and in bookstores and wherever else you purchase books. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.